the case of the witch Anne Bodenham. Today's case file comes from Salisbury in the year 1653. It is the story of an old woman, a woman nearly 80 years of age, who ended her life on the gallows, condemned for witchcraft. And, if the pamphlets are to be believed, she was no ordinary cunning woman. She was the disciple of a notorious sorcerer, the corrupter of young women, and a servant of the devil himself. Or so they said. Welcome to the Unquiet Archive, case reference W1653-001. As was common for the 17th century, Anne's story was told comprehensively in a pamphlet. This was published in 1653. The title was as extravagant as you would expect from that period. Dr. Lambe revived, or Witchcraft condemned in Anne Bodenham, a servant of his, who was arraigned and executed at the Lent Assizes last at Salisbury, before the Right Honourable the Lord Chief Baron Wilde, Judge of the Assize, wherein is set forth her strange and wonderful diabolical usage of a maid, servant to Mr. Goddard, as also her attempt against his daughters, but by Providence delivered, being necessary for all good Christians to read, as a caveat to look to themselves, that they may not be seduced by such enticements. By Edmund Bower, and eye and ear witness of her examination and confession, dated 1653. So, who was Anne Bodenham? Anne lived in Fisherton Anger, a great name for a village, just outside New Sarum, now called Salisbury. She was married to Edward, a clothier, and for much of her life she occupied a curious position on the margins of respectable society. In her younger years, she claimed to have been a servant to Dr. John Lambe, the Duke of Buckingham's infamous astrologer and sorcerer. Lambe had a reputation for dark arts, raising spirits, telling fortunes, and selling love charms. Unfortunately for him, he was stoned to death by a London mob in 1628. By linking herself to Lambe, Anne Bodenham positioned herself as a woman who possessed secret knowledge, a dangerous claim in the 17th century. In her old age, she became known locally as a kind of cunning woman. She taught children their letters, offered charms and remedies, and was said to tell fortunes. People came to her when they wanted lost items found, or when they were desperate for good luck. But her neighbours also whispered that she was much addicted to popery, inclined towards Catholic practice. In Puritan England, Catholic ritual looked a lot like witchcraft. Mysterious Latin words, holy water, relics, incense, superstition, magic and popery all blurred together. And so Anne's reputation darkened. She was no longer just a gossiping old woman with strange remedies. She was, in the eyes of many, a witch. The accusations. The spark came from a young maidservant named Anne Styles. Styles worked for a man named Goddard. Relations in the household were tense. And so, when Styles heard of Anne Bodenham's reputation, she sought her out, hoping for help. What happened next depends on which account you believe. But, according to the pamphlets, the two Annes, one young, one old, entered into a dangerous relationship. Styles first asked for the whereabouts of a silver spoon belonging to her master. The other servants had sent Styles to ask Bodenham about the lost spoon. The pamphlet tells the story. The cookmaid gave bread and meat to the witch and went to the witch's house. Bodenham welcomed her, shook her hand, rubbed her head and temples. Bodenham said she would help, but Styles should know that she would soon visit with a greater problem. Bodenham asked the maid for 12 pence and a jug of beer. She said a boy would soon return the spoon. Elizabeth Rosewell told Anne Styles to go to the witch on behalf of Master Thomas Mason, son-in-law to Master Goddard, who had lost 3 pieces of gold. So Styles went to the witch's house. The witch said Robert Beckford, a boy of Master Goddard's, had the money. The witch then demanded 7 shillings. She opened 3 books, within which was a picture of the devil with cloven feet and claws. The witch brought a green glass, laid it on top of a book, rubbed the glass and held it against the sun. She asked Styles to look in the glass, wherein she saw many people, including Elizabeth Rosewell in her mistress' chamber, her walking in the garden, her drinking beer. Upon return to the house, Styles discovered Elizabeth had been doing these things. Rosewell said that Bodenham was either a witch or a woman of God. Styles claimed that Bodenham instructed her in conjurations and circles, showed her magical books and diagrams, and even tempted her to sign a contract with blood, a pact with the devil. Then the witch took the maid's forefinger of her right hand and pricked it with a pin and squeezed out the blood and put it into a pen and put the pen into the maid's hand and held her hand to write in a book. And one of the spirits laid his hand or claw upon the witch's whilst the maid wrote. And when she had done writing, whilst their hands were together, the witch said Amen, and made the maid say Amen, and the spirit said Amen, Amen. She had received a piece of silver from the devil. The devil promised she would never be troubled as long as she kept the secret. Bodenham was further accused of boasting that she could raise spirits in the form of cats and dogs, and command them to do her bidding, and kill them with charm. Most damning of all, she was charged with being solicited to murder the Goddard family by witchcraft. Styles alleged that Bodenham promised to provide diabolical assistance to kill her master and his entire household, and so the accusations were not merely of charms or fortune-telling, but of devil worship and attempted murder. These were capital charges. The trial. Anne Bodenham was brought before the assizes, and she faced a hostile court. Witnesses described her conjurations, her circles, her muttered words. They spoke of spirits that obeyed her and of her Popish tendencies. The star witness was the servant girl, Anne Styles, who testified in lurid detail. She told how Bodenham had tried to bind her into Satan's service. The pamphlet says, "The night being come, we return praise to God for his seasonable deliverance of the maid, and because he had mercifully and suddenly given a gracious hearing to our prayers. In this time I desired some to eye the person and carriage of the witch that was in the prison house some distance from the maid, who informed me that as soon as ever the maid awaked and began to be at ease, the witch began to be tormented, and to roar and cry out, 'Oh, the devil, the devil, the devil will tear me in pieces,' running from one corner of the room to the other, shaking and rattling her fetters, striking with a stick in her hand those that were in the room, prisoners and others, crying out and cursing the maid, saying, 'Oh, this whore will be the death of me. She will hang me, and I shall be killed and torn in pieces.' And she was in such a hideous rage that the people were fearful to stay near her. I, being made aware that she was very importuned to speak to me, I left the maid and was going away, but I at a distance called to her, having then no great mind to come very near her, she being in such a furious condition, and, to satisfy her, told her that the maid was now very well, and I make no doubt but she would in a while be released. She replied, 'Yes, at the gallows, nowhere else, for I am sure I shall be hanged.' And she said to me, 'For your part, I know you are a knowing man, and if you will come to me tomorrow morning, when I may speak privately with you, I will tell you all my art.' I told her I would hearken to anything she would tell me, and would come to her the next morning. The next day, being Wednesday, in the morning I went to the prison, where I found the maid, then very well freed from her former fits, and was informed had been all that night before freed from them, and had took her rest very well. I then went to the witch, who desired me to go into a room by myself with her, which I did, and she shut the door after we were in. She then would have called for some beer to drink to me, but I would not permit her, telling her I was resolved not to drink. She then made me sit down by her, and she took a piece of silver. I think it was a shilling, and she offered it to me, telling me I must take that piece of silver off her if I intended to learn anything of her. I replied I had no need of a shilling, and I would not take it, for I was able to give her a shilling. She said, 'Give me one then, and that will be as well.' I replied, 'Not so neither, you do not want one.' She then fell a-cursing and swearing that I must take that silver of her, otherwise she could not teach me anything, I replied, "Tell me what you can do first. Happily, I can do already what you can. If not, I may learn it afterward." She replied, "Thou must keep my counsel, or else all will do thee no good, and thou must now promise to me that thou wilt not come to undermine me, to undo me." I answered, "You need not think so, for you see I am come into a room privately, that none else might know what you teach me." She then said she could cure diseases by charms and spells, and had prayers that would do so likewise, and they could cure such diseases as the best doctors could not do. She could discover stolen goods, and show anyone the thief that had them in a glass, and that she could raise spirits by reading in her books. And she then also told me that she had been a servant to Dr. Lambe, and the occasion she came to live with him, she said, was that she lived with a lady in London who was a patient many times to him, and sent her often in business to him, and in particular she went to know what death King James should die, and the doctor told her what death, and withal said that none of his children should come to a natural death. And she said she then saw so many curious sights and pleasant things that she had a mind to be his servant and learn some of the art. And Dr. Lambe, seeing her very docile, took her to be his servant, and she, reading in some of his books, with his help learnt her art, by which she said she had gotten many a penny and done hundreds of people good, and nobody ever gave her an ill word for all her pains, always called her Mrs. Bodenham, and was never accounted by a witch but by reason of this wicked maid now in prison. And then she fell a cursing of and reviling at the maid extremely. But the court had heard enough. At nearly 80 years old, Mr. Under-Sheriff, coming into the prison to her, told her she must go along with him to the place of execution. She replied, "Be you ready? I am ready," in a jolly manner, and forth she went. But before Mr. Under-Sheriff came in, I had so persuaded her that when she came to the place of execution she would confess everything, and in regard she should not be able to speak loud enough, she desired me to stand by her, and she would tell it unto me, and I should speak it out to all the people, which I told her I would. And she said she would tell them everything, and keep nothing secret. Afterwards she fell into a rage, and wished for a knife. She said she would run it into her heart's blood. Being replied unto by some, "O Mrs. Bodenham, you would not offer to do such wickedness, would ye?" She swore by the name of God, but she would, had she a knife. She then went forth to the place of her execution, where a numerous company were spectators, and as she went along towards the gallows, by every house she went by, she went with a small piece of silver in her hand, calling for beer, and was very passionate when denied. One of the men that guarded her on the way told her that Mr. Sheriff would not let her be buried under the gallows, upon which she railed at the man extremely that told her so, and said she would be buried there. When she came to the place of execution, she went immediately to go up the ladder, but she was pulled back down and restrained. I then pressed her to confess what she promised to me she would, now before she died, but she refused to say anything. Being asked whether she desired the prayers of any of the people, she answered she had as many prayers already as she intended, but cursed those that detained her from her death, and was importunate to go up the ladder, but was restrained for a while to see whether she would confess anything, but she would not. They then let her go up the ladder, and when the rope was about her neck, she went to turn herself off, but the executioner stayed her, and desired her to forgive him. She replied, "Forgive thee? A pox on thee," which were the last words she spoke. She was never heard all the while she was at the place of execution to pray one word, or desire any others to pray for her, but the contrary. And with that, the hangman obliged. Thus you have her wicked life, her woeful death. Those that forsake God in their lives shall be forsaken of him in their deaths. The aftermath. The pamphlets wasted no time in turning Anne Bodenham into a cautionary tale. She was presented as the disciple of Dr. Lambe, the Duke's conjurer, keeping alive his dark legacy. She was portrayed as proof that the devil still walked abroad in England. that old women with charms and tales could lead the innocent into ruin. Her Catholic sympathies were paraded as evidence of her ungodliness. In the religious climate of the 1650s, witchcraft and popery were often treated as two sides of the same coin. And so Anne Bodenham became a symbol, the dangerous old woman who consorted with devils, corrupted the young, and died unrepentant. But if we step back from the pamphlets, perhaps another picture emerges. Here was an elderly woman, 80 years old, in a century when few reached such an age, living on the edges of society. She had knowledge of herbs, of charms, perhaps of scraps of astrology picked up in her youth. She had a sharp tongue, and she was not afraid to use it. Those were the qualities that made her useful, perhaps even respected in some circles. However, they also made her vulnerable. When the accusation came, it stuck. A poor elderly woman with few defenders, accused by a younger servant, she had little chance. Anne Bodenham went to her death as a witch, but perhaps what her story really shows is how fear, gossip, religion and age could combine to destroy a woman's life. As for Anne Styles, when asked whether she gave way to the devil in yielding to anything that he suggested into her thoughts and mind, she answered no and said, "Indeed, the devil now appears to me from the top of the house in a fearful shape, with flaming eyes, and calls to me to come away. But I tell him I cannot. I am held, else I am afraid I should be carried away by force." So that was the story of Anne Bodenham of Salisbury. This has been another case from the Unquiet Archive. The story reminds us how easily a life could be turned into a cautionary tale, and how an old woman's defiance on the gallows could echo down the centuries. If you want to hear more stories like this, please consider subscribing to the Unquiet Archive. It really does help the channel. Until next time, keep the records close and the lights on.